All right, good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us tonight. This is meteorologist Bob Bright here at the National Weather Service in Wilmington, North Carolina. I want to thank you for giving us a part of your evening tonight to talk about a very important topic, and that's hurricanes. And I'm also very happy to be joined tonight by another member of our team up at the state level from the North Carolina Emergency Management Agency, Kevin Caldwell. He'll be joining us a little bit later once we get to the talking about hurricane preparedness. As you know, it's middle of August now. We've been in the hurricane season for a few months, and although it's been off to a pretty little busier than normal start, we haven't seen anything around here so far. Hopefully it'll stay that way for the rest of the season, but of course you never know. So we want to take this opportunity while we can, while it's still pretty quiet, to talk a little bit about hurricanes and of course other types of tropical cyclones as well, and why you should be prepared. Of course, some of you may have lived here your whole life, been through many storms. Others maybe are new to the area and haven't experienced anything like this. So hopefully there'll be something for everybody in the presentation tonight. So with that, we will go ahead and get started. We're going to talk a little bit about, first want to mention a few logistics here, but we're going to start off. Everyone will be in listen-only mode during the presentation. But if you have questions, you can enter them anytime by using the questions pane in the go-to webinar control panel. And we'll try to answer those questions at the end of the presentation if possible. We're also going to have a few poll questions that pop up, make it a little bit interactive here. So please, if you could try to participate, that would be great. There's also a PDF copy of the presentation that's available in the handouts section of the go-to webinar control panels. So you can reference the presentation afterwards. And we're also going to have this be recorded. And hopefully, if it turns out well, we'll post it on our YouTube channel as soon as we can. And that is our YouTube website right there. And then upon exiting the webinar at the end, there'll be a brief survey. If you could provide your feedback, that would be much appreciated. So the first poll question to kick things off is pretty simple. It's just, where are you joining us from? And we're going to launch this here, and hopefully it'll pop up and everybody can make their selections. So we'll give it a little more time. Looks like a few more trickling in here. Almost everybody voted. So we'll go ahead and close the poll. And here are the results. It looks like most of y'all are local to the Wilmington area from coastal North Carolina, but we also have a few farther inland in North Carolina, as well as inland portions of South Carolina and even coastal South Carolina, and then a few even outside of this area altogether. So again, thanks for participating in that. There'll be some other poll questions that will pop up during the rest of the presentation. So with that, let me get back to the presentation. So here's the outline for tonight. We're going to talk a little bit about what we do here at the National Weather Service in Wilmington, and then we'll get into the heart of the talk about tropical cyclones and some history, some hazards, forecasting, and how you can stay informed on what's going on in the tropics. And then we'll talk a little bit about how you can prepare. So our office, you may or may not know, we're part of NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, under the Department of Commerce. We are open 24/7, 365. Normally we have 23 staff members, includes mostly meteorologists, but also some electronics folks who keep our equipment running, including the radar, and then of course some management and administrative support type folks. And our office is designed to withstand most storms, so unless it's kind of a worst case scenario, we will be here operating through the storms as long as we can. Now, our area of responsibility covers 14 counties across southeast North Carolina and northeast South Carolina. But we also forecast for the Atlantic waters out 20 nautical miles, and then we have warning responsibility out 40 nautical miles. And our office right there is located, we're at the Wilmington Airport, and our Doppler radar is located down in southern Brunswick County, there in Charlotte. So what do we do? Well, our highest priority, as you can see there highlighted in the top left, is severe weather warning. So that includes a tornado, severe thunderstorm, flash flood warnings. Those are, the warnings that really take precedent. They might alert on your phone, and that's our #1 priority. But pretty close to that, which includes those warnings as well as what we call decision support services. So that's basically working with our core partners and other government agencies and military folks and media folks to help get the forecast and the warnings out to everybody. And a big part of our decision support services are tropical cyclones, and that's what we're focusing on tonight. But as you can see, there's a lot of other things that we do, all different types of forecasts, specialized forecasts, beach forecast, marine, aviation. We maintain the climate records here for the local area, and we do quite a bit of outreach and public education, such as the presentation tonight, and research and collection of data, weather observations, and radar data. All right, so we'll go ahead and jump right in and talk about tropical cyclones. So what is a tropical cyclone? You might be asking, this is a hurricane talk. So, well, hurricane is basically a type of tropical cyclone. So what is a tropical cyclone? Well, it's a system that originates over tropical or subtropical ocean waters. And they're not associated with any frontal systems. So that's one big defining difference between this type of low pressure system and other, what we call extratropical or non-tropical type systems that have fronts associated with them. These do not. They also contain organized deep thunderstorm activity, and they also have surface winds that circulate around a well-defined center. And the center is warmer than its surroundings. So these are the basic characteristics of tropical cyclones. Now this includes not just hurricanes, but also tropical depressions and tropical storms, which are just weaker forms of, in terms of the wind, weaker than the hurricanes. So what type of ingredients do we need to develop these systems? It's kind of like baking a cake. You need certain ingredients to come together. We have, we need a tropical disturbance of some sort. That could be in the form of a easterly wave, the waves that come off the west coast of Africa and travel across the Atlantic. But also it could be a little spin along a front that maybe moves through the area, moves off the southeast coast, and then provides a little impetus, a little rotation for a tropical cyclone to develop. Of course, you do need warm waters. That's how the hurricanes feed. Feed off that warm, moist air. And then also in the atmosphere higher up, you need what we call weak vertical wind shear. So in the vertical, you have winds that aren't moving real strongly in different directions. So that allows the thunderstorms to get more developed and more organized. So the stages of tropical cyclone development, we start off with a disturbance or a wave. There's really no good defined circular wind field at this point. But once we get to the tropical depression stage, we have more of a defined, better defined circular wind field. But the peak winds in the system are still less than 39 miles an hour. And then once that system gets more organized and the winds increase to 39 to 73 miles an hour, at this stage is when the system will get a name. And then once the winds get at least to 74 miles an hour sustained, we classify it as a hurricane, and we then rank them on the Saffir-Simpson hurricane scale. So we have 5 different categories, and you can see the wind speeds. Once we get to the category 3, 4, 5, those are the major hurricanes, and that's those are the systems that produce most of the wind damage, as you can well imagine. So the structure of a hurricane, once you get a hurricane, it's more well-defined and organized. It will have an eye, and that's basically the center where there really isn't much rain or wind at all in the center of the hurricane. Maybe not even a lot of clouds. Sometimes you'll even see sunshine, but that's where it's calm and maybe sunny and warm. Maybe some of you have been through the eye of a storm before, and it's just quite dramatic, the difference between the surrounding areas, which is essentially the eye wall, which is where typically you have the strongest winds to be found in that eye wall surrounding the eye. Then you also have rain bands that rotate and circulate around the center of the storm, and they can extend hundreds of miles and contain real strong winds as well as heavy rain and possible tornadoes. You can also have tornadoes within the eye wall as well. All right, so it's time for our next poll question here. And the question that will pop up is, have you ever experienced a hurricane or tropical storm or tropical depression for yourself? Because what we find a lot of times is, your past experience is going to drive your preparedness and decision making. So it's interesting to see, how many of you have actually experienced a storm and how that may impact your decisions in the future. So it looks like most of you all voted, and we can share that real quick. So it looks like most of you have experienced a storm in the past, and that's, like I said, that's a mixed blessing. Of course, don't want to go through something like that, but it also does give you the experience and knowledge for the next storm. So we will hide that. All right, so moving on, we'll talk a little bit about the hurricane season. And like I mentioned, we're already well into the season. Officially starts June 1st, and it runs through the end of November. Of course, we can also get storms outside of this period, but the official season is from June through November. And the peak is typically August through October, especially earlier in October or to mid-October. Now, if we look at the maps of where the systems typically develop by month, you can see in June in the top left image, it's usually off the southeast coast or the Gulf of Mexico, maybe Northwest Caribbean. That's typically where the time where we still can maybe have these fronts, cold fronts coming through, and then lingering off the coast, and then they could, like I mentioned before, they could develop circulation that once out over the water, and that could turn into a tropical cyclone. Then in July, we have a little higher frequency, still mostly closer to home in the Gulf off the southeast coast. But you do start to see a little bit maybe more activity down in the Eastern Caribbean and Central Caribbean. But then once we get to August, where we're at now in the current season, you can see the activity typically really ramps up off the southeast coast, and then especially going farther out into the Atlantic. And then the peak typically is in September, and you can see again those hot spots of the Gulf of Mexico, Central Atlantic, and even western portions of the Atlantic just offshore. But very close, to our neck of the woods here, but also, farther out into the Atlantic, and that's typically due to those tropical waves that are moving off the coast of Africa. And then once we get to October, things start to calm down, but the waters are still warm after a long summer, and we still can get systems develop a little bit closer to home here in the Western Caribbean, in the Gulf and off the southeast U.S. coast. And then beyond October, the activity really starts to ramp down, but we're still not completely out of the woods. Like I said, the season still goes through the end of November. Now, locally, this map here shows all the storms that have occurred on record since 1851. That have passed within 150 miles of North Myrtle Beach. And you can see they pretty much come from all different directions. But if we break that down into the first half of the year, and then the second half of the year, you can see from January through June, of course, not many storms occur, in the winter, but later in the spring and early in the summer, you can start to see more activity coming out of the Gulf, Caribbean, and then a few storms on record that have, like Bertha 96, that have come from a little bit farther out into the Atlantic. But typically, overall, a lot of those storms are on the weaker side. But then in the bottom right, as you can see, it gets way more active at the second half of the year, mainly, like I said, into early October. You can see the storms a lot more coming farther out into the Atlantic. And on average, this is just an average, but this area will see a hurricane once about every 7 years and a major hurricane once about every 20 years. So we have a few websites you can access for more information on these events and storms. But like I mentioned, there were from 1851 to 2022, there were 241 tropical cyclones within 150 miles of North Myrtle Beach. 85 of these were hurricanes, and then 15 of these were actually major, so the category 3, 4, 5 hurricanes. And I highlighted the ones in red that actually made landfall in our county warning area. So that includes from Pender County south through Georgetown County. There's 4 storms: Hazel, Diana, Fran, and Bonnie. Now, only 2 of those, however, were actually major hurricanes at landfall, and that includes Fran and Hazel. So the other 2 did not actually make landfall as a major hurricane in our forecast area. And interestingly, the strongest wind gust on record at Wilmington at least, was actually with a storm that didn't even make landfall, and that was Helene back in 1958. So what impacts, what hazards can these storms bring? As you know, since most of you have been through storms before, they could bring a variety of impacts, including water impacts from storm surge, pushing in from the ocean. You can have tornadoes and water spouts and rip currents, and of course, strong winds and heavy rainfall. So now it's time for our next poll question, and that will be, which tropical cyclone hazard do you think is the most deadly? So we got wind, rain, rip currents, tornadoes, storm surge. All right, looks like a lot of y'all voted, so we'll see what y'all said. And it looks like storm surge is the answer that most of you selected. We had some wind, some rain, and some tornadoes, and then rip currents were least deadly. So good to see that most of you thought in terms of wind, or I'm sorry, in terms of water from storm surge or rain. It's kind of a trick question because historically, storm surge is what has killed the most people, but because in recent years we've improved the forecast and warnings and evacuations along the coast, storm surge deaths have gone down pretty dramatically, and of late it's actually freshwater flooding from heavy rain, even well inland, that's unfortunately causing a lot of the fatalities. So good that you all were thinking in terms of water. Like I said, somewhat of a trick question there, but most of you were on the right track. And really, we want you to take, if you don't take anything else from this presentation, we do want you to remember that it's the water that's the most deadly aspect of a tropical cyclone. So we'll talk a little bit more about that water, and this slide addresses the heavy rain, the flooding, and storm surge. Like I said, causes most of the deaths. So it's important to know, do you live in a flood-prone area, especially if do you live in an evacuation zone? It's good to know that information ahead of time. Of course, when it comes to evacuations, and just to clarify, the Weather Service is not involved in the evacuation decisions, making those calls. We do brief the officials on the forecast, but they're the ones that make those decisions. And it's also important to remember that water is quite heavy, and of course, moving water has quite a bit of force. So these pictures maybe don't tell the whole story. It looks like a nice, calm bathtub, but when you got strong winds pushing that water around, you end up with potentially a lot more damage. And of course, we want to remind folks, because a lot of people die in their vehicles driving through flooded roads, that our good old saying of "turn around, don't drown" is what we want you to remember when you encounter a flooded road, because you don't know what's underneath the water. The road could be washed out, and there could be other hazards under there. So now, when it comes to this particular area, we're pretty vulnerable to flooding, as probably many of you saw 4 or 5 years ago in Florence. Especially, we had quite a bit of flooding from that storm, and this area, because of all the waterways and the ocean nearby, a little bit more low-lying, is very prone to flooding. And we also want you to remember that when it comes to storm surge, the Weather Service forecasts what we call inundation. So it's the storm surge. It's actually the storm surge inundation, and that's essentially the water depth above the ground. And but we're not including rainfall in those forecasts. We're also not including waves in the forecast, which, like I mentioned, can really add to the damage. That's just an estimation of the storm surge, the rise in the water level from the storm, which is technically just the storm surge, and then you add that on top of the tide level, and so that what we call storm tide moves into the coast, and then we measure the depth of water over the land, and that's what we call inundation. So if you hear a storm surge forecast of 4 to 7 feet, that means that we're expecting 4 to 7 feet of water above ground level. So of course, that's over or near over a lot of our heads. And of course, also remember that it is not necessarily stationary. It's when it comes to storm surge, it is moving. Now, in terms of the damaging winds, we also want to remind folks, that winds can occur, strong damaging winds, well away from the coastal areas. As with the heavy rain in the higher terrain and the flooding that it could cause, we can also see very damaging winds well away from the coast. So again, don't think, tropical storm, hurricane, just a coastal issue. Even folks well inland have to pay attention to these storms. And, you should be prepared to be without power for many days and possibly even weeks. If you've been around quite a while and have experienced Hurricane Hugo back in 1989, even well inland, even though that storm made landfall down near Charleston, it still was, a high-end tropical storm, low-end Category 1 hurricane, well inland around the Charlotte area, so produced quite a bit of wind damage, well away from the coast. So of course, it's best to use plywood or shutters on windows. Remember that garage doors, a lot of people don't think about those being a weak point. So if you can solidify and sturdy those up, that would be a good thing to do. Because once that wind gets in, it could more easily, cause roof damage and let more rain and cause more water damage. So make sure you strengthen up your garage doors if you can. And then also strongly consider evacuating if you live in a weakly built home or even a mobile home. Now, during a storm, it's best to go to an interior room on the lowest level, to protect yourself. And remember, if the area is prone to flooding, especially a storm surge, that can happen very quickly. You don't want to be on a low level of a structure that also could see flooding. So you also have to keep in mind of that potential. And then also try to remember that you could have falling branches and trees and things like that. So a lot to think about, but better to be prepared, obviously, and try to think about these things ahead of time. Now, when it comes to the forecast, you probably have heard of the National Hurricane Center. They're part of the National Weather Service. Their website there, hurricanes.gov, is pretty easy to remember. But they essentially track the storms, and then once a storm develops and they have they make the forecast for track and intensity. They also coordinate with the local forecast offices like ours to issue those watches and warnings for storm surge and for wind along the coast. And then what we do at the local offices, like here in Wilmington, we tailor the forecast, the big picture forecast down to our local area, and we work with our local partners at the county level and the state level to issue additional inland and marine tropical watches and warnings, and then other watches, warnings, and advisories as needed, like flood watches and things like that, and then continue to provide the critical decision support services to our partners. so that they can make those decisions to protect life and property. Now, some of the tools that are used, when it comes to tropical cyclone forecast, we do have aircraft, which is critical, the hurricane hunters from NOAA and from the Air Force. Of course, radars are critical when the storms are closer to land. We have satellite observations, which are really critical over the water. We also have surface and upper air observations from buoys and ships and our ASOS, Automated Surface Observing System stations. Also upper air sites that release weather balloons. We do not release balloons here, but Morehead City office to the north and Charleston office to the south does that, as well as Raleigh inland. And then of course computer forecast models. So a lot of this data, or all of the data, goes into the models, and then they produce the forecast, which we use to, they simulate what the atmosphere will look like in the future, and then that's what we use to make the forecast. So some of the Hurricane Center products you may have seen, they have a tropical weather outlook, so you can see, a week out. It used to be a 5-day outlook. Now this year it's a 7-day outlook, so you can get a feel for what systems might be out there and or developing. And then once the system develops and they produce that forecast, this is the cone graphic, which probably most of you are familiar with, have seen before. Of course, we want to remind folks that the cone here is not a impact cone. It's just the representation of the likely track of the center of the storm. So again, don't focus on the cone per se, but where those impacts are. You can see, we get those watches and warnings that can be well outside where the cone is, because the impacts can be well outside the cone. So remember, don't focus on the exact track. Focus on what those watches and warnings are and what the potential impacts could be. And they also produce some graphics for some of the hazards like wind, so you can get a feel for when especially the tropical storm force winds could arrive, and that's a big component to preparations. So you can see the probabilities of tropical storm and hurricane force winds, and then the timing of those winds. And then when it comes to storm surge, you can get a feel for what types of water levels we might see, what types of inundations. So again, in this example, you can see 3 to 5 feet somewhere from South Santee to Cape Fear. Again, that means that's the water depth above ground level, somewhere in that zone. So those are some of the main forecast products from the Hurricane Center. Now, when it comes to the local office like ours, we produce another set of products. I think these threats and impacts graphics are really useful tools, because it basically takes all the forecast information and pares it down into what the different threats are in terms of wind, storm surge, flooding, rain, and tornadoes, and what you should be preparing for. We also have some text products, which some of you may use, especially if you want a bigger idea about the bigger picture, like the hurricane local statement that covers our entire forecast area, that kind of just highlights the main things that we're concerned about. And there's another product, the TCV, which is more detailed on a county level. So if you want a little bit more detail, especially if you're a county emergency manager or something like that, you can get a feel for what the different hazards are and the severity of those hazards. And then after the storm, we collect all the data, what happened, the impacts, and produce a post-storm report that the media can use and other folks can use as a summary of the storm. Now, staying informed, our website there, weather.gov/ILM, is our main website. We do have a mobile version as well that you can use, but the main website is pretty mobile friendly, and I believe at some point the mobile version will be going offline in lieu of the main website there. But if you click on the map for your location, or if you enter your city, state, or zip code in the top left, it'll pull up the forecast page where you'll get more detailed information. Now, once if you scroll down a little bit more on that page, there'll be a link to access the tropical page, and that's what I'm showing now. You can go directly there through weather.gov/ILM/tropical, and basically you can get all the information, the different products. You can see the different tabs there, and you can see the threats and impacts and all the other different products that we provide, and preparedness information, and so there's a lot of information there on the tropical page. We also have a briefing page which you can look at /briefing, and that provides a lot of information as well, as far as like the severe thunderstorm impacts and the rain, and that's a briefing page that you could use all year long, not just during tropical season. And then again, the Hurricane Center main page is just hurricanes.gov. And they provide another one of their products here is the key messages. So if you're concerned, maybe the storm is several days out and you're wanting a kind of a bigger picture of, okay, here's what on a bigger scale, here's what the Hurricane Center and the Weather Service is thinking as far as the main impacts and main themes for this upcoming storm. This is a nice graphic, especially for social media purposes and things, to help drive and direct folks for preparedness activities. Now, you can also follow us on social media. We're on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, and there's our handle. And we're also, you can get our information through mobile devices such as the wireless emergency alerts, where you can get the different types of warnings. And then the trusty NOAA radio also has latest conditions, forecast, and watches and warnings as well. All right, so we'll take a little break here and do another poll question. This will actually be our last poll question, and that is: should you be preparing based on what the seasonal forecasts say? So you should be seeing it pop up. So you might notice, might have seen, NOAA will produce a seasonal forecast. Other groups like Colorado State has a forecast. A lot of different entities produce forecasts, what the season might look like based on, what the big climate atmospheric conditions, are expected to be like throughout the hurricane season. And so the question is, should you be basing what your preparedness level is based on those forecasts? So we'll close this out and we'll share the results. And we actually had almost a split here. We had 55% say yes and 45% said no. And the answer really is no, because it only takes one storm really to make it a bad season. So we really encourage folks not to focus too much on the seasonal forecast, because we have seen seasons where the activity overall hasn't been that busy in terms of the total number of storms, but it only takes one storm to hit your area to make it a bad season. So again, don't put too much stock in on those seasonal forecasts. Now, we'll start to wrap up things here, talk a little bit about preparedness and some of the things you can do to get ready. There's some websites up there that are real helpful. Of course, there's some basic preparedness actions you could take, like, again, making sure, finding out your risks. What are your risks, especially from water, but also from wind? Of course, prepare early. Boy Scouts motto. Learn how to understand, what the different forecasts and alerts are, and that's part of what we're trying to do tonight. Of course, if you have questions, you can ask us anytime. about the different forecasts and warnings and things that we issue, and then also learn what you should be doing before, during, and after a storm. So we put together a hurricane guide that kind of goes through a lot of this information, provides a lot of the background, some of the stuff we talked about tonight, but it's a pretty comprehensive guide with a lot of links and things. So we encourage you to take a look at that. The website's there. I believe we also have a link at the top of our website in the top news section. Also, you can get information from the state emergency management folks in North Carolina, the readync.gov website, which Kevin will be talking about here in a minute. And in South Carolina, the SCEMD website is there as well. And then each county also has emergency preparedness folks to that can provide some more information, more on that local level. So we encourage you to reach out to the local county emergency management office as well. So before we get into the takeaways, we will pass it over to Kevin. Make sure Kevin is with us. So he wanted to say a few words about what they do on the state level. And Kevin, can you, I can't hear you yet. Are you unmuted? Let me make sure I unmute you.
All right, can you hear me now?
All right, yes, I can hear you. Go ahead.
All right, can you see my screen with the readync.gov PowerPoint?
Yes.
All right, awesome. So good evening, everyone. As Bob mentioned, I am Kevin Caldwell of North Carolina Emergency Management. Just wanted to touch on some tools available here at the state level. So as Bob mentioned, our website is readync.gov. It is a great tool for information on how to plan, prepare, and stay informed for hurricanes, and then also really any emergency in North Carolina. So if you're in South Carolina, again, scemd.org, it's very similar with information for our neighbors to the south. So readync, it actually has a tool where it can be translated automatically into 15 additional languages in addition to English. On that website, you can provide a guide on how to make an emergency plan for your family or organization, as well as real-time information regarding weather headlines, evacuation orders, power outages, open shelters, as well as links to road conditions. So this website, again, a great tool throughout hurricane season, but also all year round, because really we can have winter weather during those winter months, as well as severe weather really anytime throughout the year. So when it comes to preparing for hurricanes, we always want people to get their information from trusted sources, just like the National Weather Service, your local news channels, and really to make sure you have those alerts enabled on your cell phones, just so you can receive those weather and emergency alerts really in a timely fashion. And then also, as Bob mentioned, and it can't be said enough, we want people to focus on the potential impacts, not just that forecast track, the forecast cone, or the storm category, because really neither of those tell you the full picture of the impacts from tropical systems. So when it comes to evacuations in North Carolina, those evacuation zones are created, and evacuation orders are typically decided at the local and county level here in North Carolina. Down in South Carolina, it's typically those evacuation orders are announced by the governor, but in North Carolina, it's typically done at the local and the county level. But here at the state level at North Carolina Emergency Management, we typically serve as the megaphone for those local announcements. So we maintain the knowyourzone.nc.gov website, where you can use an interactive address tool to see if you live, work, or are vacationing in an evacuation zone. So you can do that any time of the year before or while a storm is approaching, just to see what zone you are in or if you are not in a zone at all. So this website and predetermined evacuation zones are fairly new in North Carolina. Our Know Your Zone initiative launched just prior to the 2020 hurricane season. So this will be our fourth hurricane season where we will be utilizing those evacuation zones. Our Know Your Zone website also has links to Ready NC with that real-time information, again, such as evacuation orders and traffic and weather information. And also, I'll just note the website and interactive lookup tool. It's available fully in Spanish with its own URL there listed on the screen. And then one more just thing we have available in North Carolina. And it's a link on our Know Your Zone website to the PDF version of our annual hurricane guide. These hurricane guides are printed in English and Spanish, and they include hurricane preparedness and recovery information. We typically target outreach with these printed versions to those typically underserved communities. But if you or your organization would like any of these, feel free to reach out to me. I'll believe my contact information here is on the last slide here. But if you reach out to me there at kevin.callball@ncdps.gov, we can get you these, and we would appreciate them getting them out in your community. And I'll just note for those in South Carolina, they also have a hurricane guide available online at hurricane.sc. Again, that's hurricane.sc for those in South Carolina. For their website with similar information for just preparedness and recovery information specific to their state. So that's all I have from the state level. Again, I just want to stress again, getting that information for hurricanes and all weather information from those trusted sources, and then utilizing those tools such as readync.gov as well as your local county emergency management websites. That's all I have, Bob, and I can turn it back over to you.
All right, thank you. It's good to get your state perspective there and the importance of being prepared. It's never too late, never too early. We encourage everyone to take stock before the storms arrive. It'll make the aftermath a lot simpler. All right, let's see. All right, so we'll wrap things up here. We just wanted to throw a few key takeaways in and remind folks again that it's the flooding aspect of these systems and not necessarily the wind that is really the number one killer and usually provides the biggest impacts. So again, think water, not wind. Preparation, as we mentioned, is really important, and also to remind folks that, you know, especially those that have been through several storms already, you know just how unique every storm is and the challenges that it presents, you know, not just from a forecast aspect, but you know, preparedness aspect, and you know, you can get real strong storms in terms of wind, but maybe they're moving real quick and they don't drop as much rain, and then you get other storms like maybe they're just tropical depressions with not a lot of wind, but maybe they last a long time and they drop, you know, tons more rain. So every storm is important and unique, and you have to again focus on the current storm, the impact potential. Try not to compare the current storm to previous storms because again, you know, they're all unique in their own different way. And also don't focus just on the storm's intensity. Like Kevin mentioned, you know, just, you know, it's a Cat 1, Cat 2. Again, it doesn't, you know, there's a lot more to the storms than just the peak wind speed. So focus on the impacts, get your information from reputable sources like us, state and local officials, and local media sources who, you know, coordinate and work with us to get that information out to the public. And again, it only takes one storm to make it a bad year. So with that, we want to thank everyone again for joining us tonight. Of course, wish you a safe rest of the hurricane season.